We're delighted to have Rabbi Panitz here for the last session of this session of lectures. We hope to get him back again in the fall. We've all enjoyed it so much. We've learned, we've gotten together, and that's always fun. So now Uwe is going to come up and do the introduction tonight. Come along. And thank you so much for being with us.
Good evening. How's everyone doing tonight? Doing good? Fantastic. Well, it's very nice to see you all here for our fifth and so far final lecture in the series of world religions. It's my pleasure again to welcome Rabbi Dr. Michael Panitz to the podium here. I will not read the whole introduction, partially because I left it in my office, and while I could run over there, it would take me a while to find it, so I'm not going to do it, other than to say that most of you probably know Rabbi Panitz by now to some extent. So let me, instead of seeing a show of hands of who has come to one or more lectures beforehand, we'll see that, but let's also see the opposite. For whom is this the first time to come to a lecture here? All right, so we have one person for first time, maybe two or three. So the word has spread. So, or maybe you are the one. I thought I saw maybe another hand in the back. But so we are recording these, as you have just seen me press the record button. I've learned that much technology that I can do that now, and also the stop button. And I've learned how to upload it to our own server. So I'm growing in that direction. But Rabbi Panitz is the rabbi of Temple Israel in Norfolk, and he has been there for a good long while. 25 years? 32. So we are very fluid with the numbers here. So as a rabbi has told you, I think told the story that when we had to do an interfaith wedding just a few weeks ago, he told the lovely young couple, she was Jewish and he was Christian, that he was delighted to do the ceremony together with his good friend, Reverend Uwe Scharf, whom he knew for 25 years. Well, 25 years ago, I had not even arrived at Johns Hopkins yet. I had arrived in this country, but I was not even at Johns Hopkins yet. I was, I think, back still in Indiana, or one of the places I ministered before. So he nicely doubled the time that we knew each other. So here, 25 years, 32 years. It is to show that he is very much beloved in his congregation. He's very much sought out also in the community. He might tell you the story that he actually was interviewed for Channel 13 just today, and it showed today also, yes. So he might give you a little bit more background at that. Not a happy occasion, but important that Channel 13 reached out to him. So we have learned so much about the different world religions. Today we'll learn about religions' responses to modernity, and we have a lovely handout here. And we hope to get the rabbi back in the fall. And in town hall tomorrow, I'll talk a little bit more about it. It may be a series on faith and film or biblical characters as portrayed in movies. So we'll see. And I'm also open to hearing your suggestions, and we'll take some notes of what you might want to hear from him. But without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce my good friend Michael Panitz once more. Welcome. Thank you so much.
I just went on the cell phones. Just a reminder, maybe you should turn off your cell phone before Rabbi Panitz starts in, okay?
Thank you, Judy. Chaplain Uwe, I had a a kind of a droll thought just now. Perhaps you and I were Hindu in a former life, and in addition to our 12 years now, we had 13 years then. So maybe it is 25 years, but who knows? Um, Friends, I'll address the issue of the Channel 13 news clip before moving to my main topic. This morning, a journalist from WVEC, 13 News Now, called me. I was in the midst of a meeting with the president of our congregation. We meet every week and discuss things that rabbis and presidents need to discuss. And she told me that there'd been an anti-Semitic incident in Chesapeake, Virginia, not the Chesapeake, in Chesapeake, Virginia, and would I be prepared to comment on it? So I told her that I needed to get across the water before too late in the afternoon because I was going to the Chesapeake. So we had a little bit of a smile about that, but we arranged to meet each other at the congregation that I serve. In short, a woman who works in the Harris Teeter grocery store in Greenbrier, the section of Chesapeake, Virginia called Greenbrier, finished her shift, came out to her car, and saw some really vile anti-Semitic leaflets that were stuck onto her windshield, fixed under the windshield wiper. And she was quite upset. She contacted the Chesapeake police. They told her that, unfortunately, there's not very much they can do. If security cameras from the mall had captured the image of the person who had done it, they could prosecute that person for trespass, which is not very high up the scale. It's not like 34 counts of I won't go there. Forget the end of that sentence. You know what I was going to say. So she then did the next thing that you can do if the police only give you but so much succor. You go to the press, right? So she went to Channel 13, and Channel 13 contacted me. So the woman, the journalist, showed me her photograph of the offending material. And she asked me if I'd seen anything like it before. And truth is, I'd seen it all too often before. I once saw a similar anti-Semitic pamphlet slipped into the cart that volunteers take from room to room in a hospital. I was visiting the sick at Lee Memorial Hospital in Virginia Beach. Maybe some of you know where that is. And I saw this just vile literature. So I brought it to the attention of the hospital administration, and they were, of course, very remorseful, very contrite, and very good about disavowing it and also about policing that cart better so that it'll only have materials that really are meant for the healing of patients. But the truth is, violence is very deep inside the human condition. Since most people in this room are familiar with the Judeo-Christian tradition, I'll connect this to the 6th chapter of Genesis. Why does God Almighty determine to inundate the world? There were other stories of universal floods going back to the end of the Ice Ages. But Genesis is unique among the stories in assigning an ethical reason for God's decision to send a flood. And the reason given in Genesis chapter 6, I'll quote to you the Hebrew, then I'll translate it. Vatimale haaretz hamas. The earth was filled with violence. That's the reason given in the Bible's retelling of this familiar post-Ice Age flood story. So violence is indeed part of the human condition, and God recognizes that there is a wickedness in the human heart, Even at the end of the flood story, Genesis chapter 8, verse 22, God recognizes that the human heart has this wickedness, a potential for wickedness, which is within it, and God resolves not to flood the world again, but to try to help people regulate their behavior by covenants. So chapter 9 is the covenant with the children of Noah. And the Bible is a nested series of covenants. The largest one, the Hebrew Bible, is the covenant at Sinai with the entire people of Israel, which begins with the Ten Commandments. So, granted that we are an aggressive species, much of this aggression comes out towards those whom we demonize as the alien, not us. There's my brother, and then there's the other. And someone that we consign to otherness is somehow fair game for all the most violent tendencies that we have in our aggressive human heart. That's at the intersection of psychology and history. In the Western world, the Jew has often been the one high-profile minority. Throughout the Middle Ages, in the countries that we call Christendom, and also the other lands that we call the House of Islam, the Jew was the most identifiable minority. So the tendency to demonize the other really became crystallized into this long and sad, I hate to use the word tradition because there's nothing good about it, but this long and sad tradition of anti-Semitism, and it continues to this day. In fact, it has grown alarmingly worse in the last decade, the last 7 or 8 years, and the last 7 or 8 months. So it's worse and worse. So when the reporter asked me, is this new to you? Most of it is unfortunately not at all new, but the human mind is endlessly inventive. There was one new feature of it which is bizarre, but let me tell it to you in case you should hear it from someone else. One of the leaflets that this cashier found claims that the deity that we know as Jehovah is really I'm not believing this, I'm reporting this, okay? Don't say that the rabbi is preaching this, okay? Is an alien who has possessed, alien possession, I don't know, 3 out of every 10 Jews or 7 out of every 10 Jews in the world. So the reason why Jews, according to this anti-Semitism, are so misanthropic is that they're possessed by aliens. To me, I would say anti-Semitism enters the science fiction age. One of the scariest movies I ever saw as a kid was called Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Remember that? Ooh. So if you have a mashup of Invasion of the Body Snatchers with this horrible anti-Semitic protocols of the elders of Zion, you get what was put on that poor lady's windshield today. So the journalist was appropriately horrified. I'm glad that she was horrified. And she spoke to me. And at the end of the 20-minute interview, I mean, she gave me fair warning. She said, these 20 minutes are going to be boiled down to 10 or 20 seconds. I said, I understand that's how television journalism works. I'm not at all offended. I'm glad that you contacted me and feel free to contact me again. She said, you may regret that. I said, no, I won't. I'm happy to be your source for, if you need a rabbi to talk to, feel free to come talk to me. So she said, what is your final message? I said, my final message is that if any of your viewers or listeners should find this kind of trash, their first impulse is to throw it out. But they should not do that. They should use it as an opportunity to raise consciousness and mobilize good people to stand up for each other. So that's the message I left her with. So if you missed the Channel 13 news, now you didn't miss it. Okay, friends, turning to our main subject for this evening. we've become friendly, and I feel blessed that this is not simply a matter of going to a lecture hall where the lights are on me and I can't see the audience. That sometimes happens in lecture halls. But we've interacted, we've gotten to know one another, and I really appreciate getting to know you. I think you're a wonderful community of men and women, and I feel privileged to be part of this. So I want to tell you something personal. When I was, you might think I'm young now, but when I was really young, when I was about 20 or so, I was on the cusp. I didn't know which of two careers to go into. Did I want to go into congregational service as ordained clergy, because I am an ordained rabbi, or did I want to go into the life of academia as a professor? I always appreciated both. So, not really being able to choose, I've done both. I serve a congregation. I've served congregations for over 4 decades. As you know, the most recent one for 32 years here in Norfolk, Virginia. I'm also a university professor. I taught at William and Mary, not at all far from here. These days I teach at Old Dominion, I teach at Virginia Wesleyan, and my field of specialty is history. I have a PhD in history, focusing on religious history. So, for the other lectures in this series, I have focused on the religious side of the house. Okay? Essentially speaking, what is Buddhism? What is Hinduism? And so on and so forth. Today, I explicitly want to look at the intersection of religion and history. How does one religion or how does another religion cope with or respond to changing times? Because it happens to every religion. Now, folks don't often talk that way, and I know why. If you believe, and you have every reason to believe this, my religion is my channel to the divine. Well, God is God. And God in 1750 and God today is still God. So why would you even use historical categories in talking about religion? But the answer is very simple. Anyone here a trained lawyer? Have any people who practice law here? Well, anyone here who's signed a contract in their life? Okay. You have the party of the first part, and you have the party of the second part, right? Let's say that God is the party of the first part. You and I are the party of the second part. And we are creatures of history. So, I'm Jewish. My ancestors in the 1600s were Jewish. God is God, but their world was different from my world. So the way in which I live out my Jewish walk with God is different than the way in which my own ancestors 400 years ago walked their Jewish walk with God. It's inevitable. We can't avoid being part of our history. And so the intersection of history and religion should be of interest to us, and that's what I want to talk about today. In recent generations, we have perceived a kind of a waning of religious engagement on the part of many of our neighbors here in Western society. Let me just show you some of the poll data that I have on the first and second, but it's really the front and back of the first page. In the year 2023, the Gallup polling organization asked a sampling of Americans, how many of you would rate religion as very important? And the answer was 45%, which, by the way, is a higher figure than you'd see in Western Europe today, probably significantly higher. How many of you would say not very important? And they said 28%. So it looks as if America is a respectably religious country. But track this information back in time. So if you go back to 1993, which is the bottom of the inside page, 45% is significantly lower than the 59% back then who said religion was very important. 28% who said that religion is not very important is much, much higher than the 12% of 1993 who said it wasn't very important. And if I were to extrapolate these numbers further back, you'd see that it's still more dramatic. So the truth is, the life of religious engagement is waning in our own generation. But I want to give you a long view of this, to ask, why is this the case? I'm going to give you a hypothetical. There's an airplane disaster, God forbid, airplane disaster, and a plane falls out of the sky, and fatalities, no one survives. Let me give you several possible reasons and ask you just a quick show of hands if you think that one of these reasons is plausible. You can vote more than once. Reason number one, some mechanical failure with the frame of the airplane or the systems of the airplane as the reason. How many think that's a plausible explanation? Okay. Reason number two, human error. The pilot made some fatal mistake. Fair number have their hand up. Reason number three, the stars were aligned and it was the unlucky day for the pilot. No? No, okay. Reason number, you don't read the astrology columns? Reason number four, the pilot was a flagrant sinner and heaven was punishing him. No one. Reason number five, a majority of the passengers were flagrant sinners and heaven was punishing them. Okay, so it seems as if when we want to answer questions of this nature, our default assumptions fit within a certain box. By the way, I'm not critical of it. I endorse it myself. But that box is what we would call naturalistic. Naturalistic. That box is not what we call supernaturalist. Okay? Maybe most of the people here enjoy going to worship services. I didn't take that poll and I don't need to. But let's assume that many of us do. Even those of us who enjoy going to worship services, even those of us who pray, with a full heart, when it comes to answering a question of the way of such I just posed, we move towards a naturalistic paradigm for explaining things in the world. Would you agree? That's what we do. Now, there's a name for what I'm describing, and that name is secularization. It's a long word, but you now know exactly what it is. Secularization is when confronted with something you need to explain in this world, your first impulse is to look to the laws of nature and to frame your explanation within the laws of nature. Now, I'm going to quote to you a non-secular response to that. You've heard Chaplain Uwe and maybe Judy as well make mention of the fact that I'm very interested in how faith is depicted in film, in cinema. In fact, I'm working on an extended project which would be a viewer's guide to Bible movies. So let me quote for you a little scene from the 1951 movie David and Bathsheba, which some of you might remember, starring Gregory Peck and Susan Hayward. Boy, what a Bathsheba she was. And remember that bath that Bathsheba took. And the music was, the music was very lush at that point, right? So there's a scene in the Bible where the Ark of the Covenant is being brought to Jerusalem. David is very happy about this. It's on an ox cart, which, by the way, is not the way it's supposed to go. It's supposed to be on poles. Priests are supposed to carry it like that. David already did something wrong. It's on an ox cart. The ox stumbles, the cart tips, the ark is falling, and the soldier named Uzzah wants to hold it so it doesn't fall. A noble impulse. Don't let it hit the ground. What happens in the Bible to Uzzah? Anyone remember from 2 Samuel? He dies. And he dies in the movie as well. The prophet Nathan, by the way, wonderful portrayal by a great actor. Remember the actor Raymond Massey? Yeah, great actor. Okay, so he's portraying the prophet Nathan, and he decrees that the time is not right for the ark to be brought into Jerusalem, and they create a pavilion, and it stays right there. David, the character David, not David in the Bible, but in the movie, the character David is somewhat cynical about all this, but he lets Nathan take care of religious things. He's got his own fish to fry. Later on in the movie, David says to Nathan, maybe he died of natural causes. It was a hot day. He was overweight. He was excited. Maybe he had a heart attack. I'm not saying anything that's unfaithful, Nathan. I'm just saying that maybe he died of natural causes. Do you understand 1951? Do you understand the character David's argument there? You know what Nathan says? All causes are from God. All causes are from God. And yet, in our little exercise right now, we didn't say, nobody protested. And no one said, okay, Rabbi, so it was mechanical failure, but all causes are from God. None of you said that. I'm not blaming you. I'm pointing out that we have become somewhat secularized in our thinking. That's not a bad thing. It's just a fact of life. So for a few minutes, I want to talk about how this happened. We need to go back to about the early 1600s. People knew about spyglasses. It was very important if you saw the mast of a sailing ship, just a tiny little stick on the horizon, and it's coming towards your harbor. You need to know as quickly as possible whether it's friend or foe. Because if it's foe, you need to man the cannon on the fortress. Certainly before you get into range of their cannon. So people knew about spyglasses. A professor of mathematics and physics had this brilliant idea in 1609 to turn his spyglass heavenward and to see what he would see. His name was Galileo. And what he saw shook the faith of his church at that time. Because they had reached certain conclusions about the physical world, which was based in part on the great philosopher Aristotle, but in part on the literal way in which they read certain scriptures of the Bible. So they believed certain things that his telescopic views were disconfirming. He had a patroness, a woman who took care of him and kept him, well paid, and protected him at court when he needed some protection. She was the Grand Duchess Christina of Tuscany, of the Medici family. And she wrote to him and said, "Dear Galileo, you're going too far. You're stirring up a hornet's nest. You shouldn't be doing all this." And he said, "Most gracious Madam, Grand Duchess Christina of Tuscany, I'm a good Catholic." He was a good Catholic. His whole life long, he was a good Catholic. "I believe that God speaks to us in two books. One book is the book of Holy Scriptures, dictated to our evangelists by the Holy Spirit. I believe in it. God speaks to us in a second book. That is the book of nature. Everyone can read the book of nature. It's God's handiwork. But you have to read the book of nature literally. It means what it means. But the Holy Spirit can use poetry as well as prose in order to inspire the human heart. So when we have a verse in Scripture that disagrees in its literal understanding with a finding of natural science, there's no conflict as long as you remember that the Bible is to be understood figuratively, metaphorically, dramatically, not literally. Literally is the only way to understand nature. And then Galileo had a wonderful aphorism, because he was thinking about how do the heavens go around? Does the sun go around the earth? Does the earth go around the sun? Galileo said, the Holy Spirit is not trying to teach us in the Bible how the heavens go. The Holy Spirit is trying to teach us how to go to heaven. Isn't that a wonderful way of putting it? 400 years ago, Galileo already understood how to handle any possible conflicts of so-called faith and reason. But the world didn't follow him. And as you go from the 1600s into the 1700s, into the 1800s, into the early 1900s, you have more and more examples of just clashing conflicts. I'll give you an infamous American example of this. 1925, Dayton, Tennessee. A biology teacher gets arrested for teaching Darwin's theory of natural selection in the origin of species. His name is Scopes. He's put on trial. It's a spectacle. You thought that the O.J. Simpson trial was a media circus. You thought that the trial in New York City a month ago was a media circus. The Scopes trial was a true media circus. You had circus acts descending on Dayton, Tennessee. You had this fellow with a chimpanzee dressed up as Charles Darwin. Not the man, the chimpanzee. He dressed up as, and he talked about the theory of devolution, not evolution, right? So, and if you want to watch a very fine movie about that with wonderful acting, I recommend you watch the movie Inherit the Wind, starring Spencer Tracy portraying Clarence Darrow, the defense attorney, Frederick Marsh portraying William Jennings Bryan for the prosecution, and a very young Harry Morgan, long before he played Colonel Potter on MASH, plays the judge in that case. Anyway, the real judge in that case fined Scopes $100. He was found guilty. The American Civil Liberties Union appealed to the highest court in Tennessee, and the highest court in Tennessee threw out the conviction on a technicality, because according to the Tennessee statutes in practice in 1925, any fine higher than $10 had to be the result of a jury decision, not the judge from the bench. Now, I want to speculate with you. I don't know this for a fact, but I want to speculate. Don't you think the judge knew that? He's a sitting trial judge. I think that the judge was embarrassed by this. He didn't want it to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think he intentionally sabotaged this so the case would be thrown out. So the Tennessee High Court, not the U.S. Supreme Court, the Tennessee High Court throws out the conviction. Tennessee declines to prosecute again. In other words, it's a mistrial, but Tennessee decides just to let it go. And so the American legal system had no definitive word on whether it was okay to teach evolution in public schools or not until 1968, McLean versus Arkansas, where in the aftermath of the Sputnik, remember the Russians put up Sputnik, the Soviets, were losing the space race. If you know the movie Hidden Figures, which takes place right near here, you know how distressing it was to us that the Ruskies are winning the space race and not us. So we're pumping money into science and math education in the United States. That's when it finally went to the Supreme Court to decide whether it's a violation of the separation of church and state to prohibit teaching evolution in public schools. So in other words, America is a laboratory for the fight here between faith of a certain kind and reason. So I've shown you a couple of examples. Let's see how it played out. I'd like to read a poem with you. It's on the second page by one of the great British poets of the 19th century. Just a quick show of hands. Does anyone know the name of the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold? Does that name ring a bell? So he wrote a poem called Dover Beach. Now, you might know the White Cliffs of Dover, right? Dover, which is at the southeastern corner of the United Kingdom. So he's looking at Dover Beach, and he has these religious thoughts. Let me read this for you. The sea is calm tonight. The tide is full. The moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast, the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand, glimmering and vast, out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window, sweet is the night air. Only from the long line of spray where the sea meets the moon-blanched land, listen. You hear the grating roar of pebbles, which the waves draw back and fling. At their return up the high strand, begin and cease, then again begin, with tremulance cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound of thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. Ah, love, let us be true to one another. For the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. A great poem. The sea of faith. Once it was full tide, once it was high tide of faith. Now the tide is going out. He's writing this in the mid-1800s. He's saying fewer and fewer and fewer people allow faith to be the guidepost of how they live their life. And since then, that process that Matthew Arnold saw and lamented has become more entrenched. Now, what have religions done in response to the waning of the religious impulse. Some of them have found ways to accommodate the modern temper. In my congregation, just to take one by way of example, when I talk about anything that has a scientific explanation and I quote the scientific explanation, no one is saying, "Rabbi, you're a turncoat." You know the name of Benedict Arnold? There was a very sweet older lady in my congregation who had come to America, not as a child, but as a grown woman. And her son did something that she felt was a betrayal. She said, "Oi, you are a real Arnold Benedict." Arnold Benedict. No one says, "Rabbi, you're studying science and you call yourself a rabbi? What a Benedict Arnold." No one is saying that. And I'll tell you when it really, as we say, when the rubber hit the road. 4 years ago, 4.25 years ago, when COVID began taking its toll. In my congregation, and in many congregations of where I stand culturally, the thought was not, well, God will protect the faithful. No one was saying that, not in our congregations. We're not a snake-handling congregation. People were saying, by all means, come up with a sensible mask-wearing policy. Our first duty is to keep ourselves safe, to keep each other safe. And so for a while, we had only virtual worship services. And then we resumed in-person services with social distancing. We actually had someone use masking tape to show you can sit here, and if you sit here, the next person can sit here, and so on and so forth. What about the members of the choir? Can they sing? Do they have to sing with masks on? Now, some of you have been to a high holiday service where the ram's horn is taken, right? So what if you're blowing through the ram's horn? What if you've got COVID and you're blowing it into the congregation? It so happens that the gentleman who blows the ram's horn for us is a medical doctor. He's a pediatric endocrinologist, as it happens. He actually stood by the door and blew the shofar into the street rather than into the congregation because he was afraid of infecting us. We had some engineer take a look at the size of the sanctuary and did some calculations and looked at our air handling system and said, if you're all masked up, you can be safe for 2 hours. Now, in a Protestant service, 2 hours seems like a very long service, right? 1 hour and everyone's looking like this, right? But in a traditional Jewish service, we're not going anywhere. It used to be 3 hours. I was a daring progressive when I came to Norfolk. I cut it down to 2.5. And there was some squawking, by the way. But when COVID came and people said to me, "Rabbi, can you make it a 2-hour service?" I said, "Consider it done." And, a little bit of scissors here, a little bit of scissors there. And one of my messages is not given in the service. I give it as a video message. It's now archived. I found a way, and now we're used to a 2-hour service. We start at 9:30, we finish at 11:30. By 11:40, we're having lunch together. So, looking at the last 5 years in the history of my congregation, and many, many congregations, we're not outliers. I'm just using this as an example. Show you that here are people who have decided to accommodate the modern temper of the times, the naturalistic paradigm of how we explain things, None of us feel that we are people of insufficient faith because we wear masks. None of us feel that there's something wrong with our religiosity because we held the service to 2 hours. So that's an example of accommodating the modern temper. There are other consequences of that. And frankly, I think some of these other consequences are very lovely. Because there's not only natural sciences that are part of the modern temperament, there's also social sciences, anthropology, sociology. And modern-looking congregations that have this habit of thinking are prepared to say, why do I worship God my way? It has to do with my culture. My religion is a little bit like my language. It's my spirit language. If my spirit language is Judaism, it doesn't mean that the spirit language of Christianity is wrong. It's just different. Right? If my mother tongue is German and your mother tongue is French, it doesn't mean that one of us is wrong. We have different ways of packaging our human experience and saying what we want to say. So part of this notion of accepting the findings of the modern world when it comes to religions is ecumenism. Just in the last couple of years, I think of what my synagogue has done with houses of worship of other faiths. Together with the Second Presbyterian Church, our Jewish congregation has participated in Red Cross blood drives. Together with the First Lutheran Church on Colley Avenue in Norfolk, our congregation has participated in sheltering the homeless programs. These ecumenical programs wouldn't have happened if our mindset was, those folks are going to hell. And the less I have to do with them, the safer I am. Because, it's a little bit contagious. First I give blood with them, and then I might think the way they think. Okay. So notice that the ecumenical impulse is part and parcel of this notion of it's okay to be part of the modern world. But since I've mentioned COVID, you clearly know that the opposite was also in evidence. Okay? There were plenty of churches, and there are plenty of churches where they say, if I give in to masking and social distancing, it means I don't have enough faith. We've seen it, and they're not far from here. And they may be more numerous than churches of the opposite ilk. That general tendency is called fundamentalism. That's the name for it. Fundamentalism starts in the late 1800s in America, and it gets stronger in the 1900s. It was in display, for example, in this Scopes trial that was called the monkey trial that I talked about. And you have it on Christian radio. And any Sunday morning you can catch it. Just turn on the radio and you'll hear it. If my faith is right, the secular world has to be wrong. That's the idea here. Because the secular world is suggesting that my Bible isn't true. And my Bible is true, and therefore they're wrong. That's the fundamentalist mindset. In other words, they do not agree with what Galileo said 4 centuries ago. Now, there's something else that needs to be mentioned as well. Part of the rejection of modernity is a violent rejection. A rejection that involves going back to this human propensity for violence. Think of how many Ku Klux Klan church bombers in Alabama in some of our lifetimes, in most of our lifetimes. Think how many of them went to their own churches faithfully every Sunday morning. I mean, it's bizarre when I think about it. On Saturday night, you go out and commit a lynching, a murder, a brutal maiming. Sunday, you go to church. You're washed in the blood of the Lamb. Hey, we're all sinners, but faith will get us through. So there is a propensity to violence. It's not exclusive to one religious group or another. Remember that the Stalinists were atheists, and they have the murders of tens of millions of victims on their heads. Remember that Mao Zedong, tens of millions of murders. And so I'm not suggesting that religious zealots have a monopoly on violence, but there is a lamentable ability of people who have that kind of faith to square it with that kind of violence. And you see the most blatant example of that today in the parts, not all, parts of the Muslim world. It goes back to the 1700s, a particular Muslim theologian whose name was Ibn Wahhab, Wahhab, Ibn Wahhab. He asked a very understandable question. If my faith is the true faith, which he believed it was, why is Allah allowing me to lose? Because think about it, by the 1700s, large Muslim states and empires were losing everywhere. The British were conquering the Mughal India subcontinent. It was Muslim-ruled India, huge part of the world, was falling under British domination. The Austrians were defeating the Ottoman Empire time after time after time. It started in 1683 with the failure of the jihad that the Ottoman Sultan proclaimed. He was besieging Vienna, and the Holy Roman Emperor called in an alliance with his ally, the King of Poland. They were fellow Roman Catholics. The King of Poland's name was Jan Sobieski. He marched down to the hills around Vienna. He climbed up the hills on the backside of the hills where no one thought that you could get up there with cavalry. And in the morning, he came racing down and destroyed the Ottoman army. Guess what day the Polish cavalry had this huge defeat of the Ottomans? In 1683. Just guess what month and what day. As soon as I tell you the answer, something's going to make sense. September 11th. Oh my God. Remember, Osama bin Laden knew his history. He didn't know his ethics, but he knew his history. September 11th, 1683, the day that the high tide of Muslim jihad crashed against the shore and began retreating. So a century later, Ibn Wahhab is asking the question, why does Allah allow us to lose war after war? And his answer is that we're not strict enough. We're letting these lily-livered, weak-kneed pseudo-Muslims get away with pretending that they're good Muslims. They're not good Muslims. They drink a little bit of wine when no one's looking. They make peace treaties with Christians. How is that jihad? That's why Allah is allowing us to lose. Now, among all the theologians of 18th century Muslim world, why am I focusing on Ibn Wahhab? Because he had an important connection with a particular noble house of Arab nobility named the Ibn Saud house. Is the story beginning to get clear now? Saudi Arabia. Okay. Wahhabism is the official theology of Saudi Arabia. And all the madrasas, all the mosques, and all the schools, parochial schools around the world that are paid for by Saudi subventions are teaching Wahhabism. Think about that. So, one kind of anti-modernism produces ISIS and Taliban and Al-Qaeda and those kinds of examples of terrorism. You may hear a Muslim cleric telling you with a lot of justification that jihad really means the struggle for self-control. That's the greatest jihad. I wish it were true. It's not what Osama bin Laden thought. It's not what ISIS thinks. It's not what Hamas thinks today. It's what the imams that I love to sit and have coffee with. It's what they believe. God bless them. But it's not what the people who are killing my people believe. So we need to know that religion isn't often just one thing. Religion is often people who say they're the same religion but have quite different practical cases. I'll give you one more American example of that. Famous Christian poem from the mid-19th century. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He has trampled out the vineyards where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Okay, who wrote that? Battle Hymn of the Republic, Julia Howe. What does her Christianity say about slavery? It's got to go. Hers is the Christianity of William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist. So to be a Christian in America in 1850 included the statement, my Christianity must mean that slavery has to be abolished. But right here, whatever was the parish closest to where we are sitting right now, in 1850, I promise you that the sermons given there on slavery in 1850 were not Julia Howe's sermons, were not William Lloyd Garrison's sermons. Now, here's the wrong question. The wrong question is, well, which one was the authentic Christian? Why is that the wrong question? It's the wrong question because it forgets that religion always has to bump up against history. Personally, I think that Julia Howe was the right Christian. I'll bet most of you do too. But that's the wrong question because it's not the question that applies to what their history really was like. So you could be a Christian, you could be a Methodist, you could be a Baptist, you could be a Presbyterian in 1860. And if you believed or didn't believe that slavery was God's will, then you split. Why do you think there were Northern versus Southern Presbyterians for a century? Why was the Presbyterian Church only reunited a century after the Civil War? Because of that. So don't be surprised that there are people in the Muslim world who have very different ideas of what jihad is. Some of them will tell you it's the struggle for self-control. Some of them will tell you it's the armed killing of infidels. Or, by the way, of weak-kneed, lily-livered Muslims who aren't Muslim enough. They're also infidels. That's also part of this theory. So we have to be aware of the fact that one of the ways in which religion confronts modernity is not only to reject it, but to reject it violently. Let me conclude with the sincere hope that not the waning of the religious impulse and not the violent rejection of modernity will ultimately be the final answer to this question of how does religion confront modernity, but rather the kind which says, God makes us, God makes the human mind. Let's use our minds for good, and let's thank God for those gifts. Thank you so much for your attention. Judy, do we have time for any questions, or are we turning into pumpkins now? Okay, well, I won't turn into a pumpkin for a few minutes. So, Chaplain Uva, are you going to be our moderator?
Yes, I will.
Oh, Judy has a microphone.
Oh, good.
I'm here to run around. You can stand up here.
All right.
And Rabbi, you can answer the questions. So does anyone have a question? Come on now. Give me a chance to run around.
We have a question there. There we go. Right on the aisle.
Oh, okay.
How much do you think my parents were a Baptist, Methodist, whatever it happens to be, so therefore I have influences what we actually think as opposed to studying on our own, reading the Bible, etc.
How much do I think religious engagement is a product of home environment? It used to be almost completely. Used to be. In 2006, I don't have the most current data, but in 2006 there was a Gallup poll that asked Americans, how many of you are practicing a religious way, denomination or system, different than the one you were raised in? In 2006, it was 1/4 of adult Americans were practicing a different religious way than the one they've been raised in. I haven't looked at the recent data. I'm sure it's higher. So still a very important, but less so. And let me explain why. Joey goes off to college, falls in love with Susie, and they belong to different denominations. There was a time that would be the end of it. That, in fact, Susie's parents would say to her, don't date anyone who's not of your denomination. That way, there's no risk that you fall in love with them. But nowadays, that taboo has pretty much fallen. So the notion that I need to follow my parents' choice is less. Another reason, America has become very much consumerist. It's a buyer's market. My spouse and I go to town and we want to find a church. That already puts us into a smaller number than it used to be, that we want to find a church. So we go to a church and we find that they are tolerant of the noise that little children make. And we like that. So we go to that church. Or we don't like little children making noise in church. We go to a church and we find that the children are ushered out quite properly. And we like that. So we go to that church. Or maybe the minister, maybe the pastor stood online and just charmed us with his smile. He was so accessible. He didn't say, call me Pastor Jones. He said, call me Pastor Steve. We liked that. Some of us don't like that. Okay? I don't want my pastor to be my kindergarten teacher like Miss Molly from Romper Room. I want to be Pastor Jones. Right? So in other words, people choose churches for reasons that I would call atmospheric, rather than because it's my parents. So that's why I think the numbers are declining. It's still a factor, but less. That's my sense of it.
Anyone else? Come on.
Karen has a question.
Wait for the microphone.
I'm interested in the survey here of how many of us are following the religion of our parents.
I thought you were going to say that. I really did. How many, show of hands, How many of us are engaged in the same religious denomination as our parents were? I'll raise my hand. Okay, that's interesting. And how many, a different one? A fair number. And how many of us are, quite frankly, not engaged in any particular religious tradition? A few. Okay, all fair answers. Is it what you expected, Karen? More or less? It's more or less what I expected too. Not following at all. Or not following my parents.
Yeah.
Yes, following my own, but not my parents.
Especially as we age.
Well, yes. Sir. Don't mess with this lady.
So I was born in a place called Nebraska, in the Sand Hills. And if you weren't a Baptist, then you just weren't anything. So I was raised in a very, very staunch Baptist. I don't say that as a negative, but just reflecting back on those days. And there were 10 or 11 rules. I won't go through all of them. But one of them was, if you marry a Catholic, you're going to hell.
Mm-hmm. I know that rule.
And then there was this lady that I met. And we fell in love. She was a Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
So we tried a couple of Baptist churches, and then she didn't like that. We tried a couple of Catholic churches. No, I didn't like that. So we became Episcopalians.
Okay. You found a halfway house for you. That's an American story, right? By the way, do you know where Creighton University is in Nebraska? Creighton?
Yes, I don't know it. I went to the university.
Yeah. Isn't that Roman Catholic, Creighton?
Yes.
Because I had an opportunity to become a faculty member there. It didn't work out, but I almost ended up there. Creighton.
Okay, anyone else? Come on, Bobby.
Yeah, right up here.
Okay, Linda.
So we that go to traditional churches found a change in how the church is led with more modern music and all that. Have you found a change in your services, or are you more traditional? You know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying. I should tell you that the motto of my denomination is tradition and change. We believe that each one has what to say to a well-rounded life. So we try not to see them as polar opposites, one is right, one is wrong, but it's a matter of finding your balance point. And they're actually factors that may change even from one congregation to the next. But if you're looking for a balance point, and of course, I find it's very important to have a certain amount of charity, to know that my comfort zone isn't my neighbor's comfort zone. And that doesn't mean my neighbor's comfort zone is wrong. It means that we have to find a way to be community. So that's important. I'll give you one little example. Tunes, the melodies of particular prayers can be something that people fight over. There's a
We do the same thing.
there's a closing hymn in the Saturday morning service, Eternal God, Adon Olam. And there was a particular German Jewish melody from the 1600s. It goes like this. Da 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 dum bum bum da 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 da. Anyone ever hear that melody? Okay. So I make it a point that that's not the only melody I use. I'll sometimes use the melody that wasn't popular amongst German Jews. I'll use the melody that was popular amongst Spanish Jews. Da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-dum, and then sometimes I'll take a melody from modern times. I fit the Adon Olam to this melody. Tell me if you know it. Just raise your hand if you know it. Da ba da 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 dum bum 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 ba da dum sad to say I'm on my way. Won't be back for many a. Okay, so I made that fit. I made that fit the last prayer. They love it, but not every congregation would love it. I wouldn't do it in a place where the people didn't like it. No. So when it comes to tradition and change, I think the most sincere bit of advice I can give is let's have humility. I think that's really important. Sir, near the back.
Just use the words tradition, change. How do you see Islam? How do you see the Jewish religion changing with time and Christianity?
Did you ask about Islam also or not?
How do I see Judaism changing with time, and how do I see Christianity changing with time? That sounds like next year's lecture series. I'm not really sure if I should answer that on standing on one foot, but I will give you a general answer. The difference, I'm going to use the language that sociologists use. It's a very interesting discipline, studying the behavior of groups. They have a distinction between what they call a church and what they call a sect. For them, a church exists in more or less peaceful relationship with the general society, low degree of tension. I'm a Christian, let's say I'm an Episcopalian, and I have certain feelings about what's wrong about society, but I want to stay engaged and make it better. That's what I want to do. A sect says, they are wrong. And you who claim to be my faith, you're wrong too, because you don't do it right. A sect has a sense of a high degree of tension between people who are my circle and people who are not. So in terms of how does a religious group change, it depends a lot on whether it's a church or a sect. If it's a sect, it's going to want to keep the distance between myself and those heathens always high. And if it's a church, it'll want to know maybe God is speaking through them as well. And I'll just give you one example of that. Many churches have come to a radically different position regarding questions of gender than they were 25 or 50 years ago. Okay? I believe the Episcopal diocese has a female bishop. Am I right? You wouldn't have had that 50 years ago, right? And that's because, as I understand it, the Episcopal Church sociologically is a church and not a sect. On the other hand, you're not going to find a chief rabbi of the Hasidic Jews who's female. Not now, not 50 years ago, not 50 years from now, probably. You understand? So it depends on what kind of a group it is. I hope I've begun to answer your question. Okay, maybe one more? Yes, sir.
Do you see a move away from ritualism in the various, do you see a move away from ritualism, rituals and services and the top-down hierarchy, the way churches are run sometimes? Do you see a change in that over the decades?
Well, those are two questions, but that's okay. That's okay. Ritual. Ritual is to say behavior that has a particular meaning for a particular group. Right? So I can imagine, let me make something up. The first church of proper hygiene. I'm making this up. First Church of Proper Hygiene says that if you're right-handed, you start to shave from this corner. And if you're left-handed, you start to shave from this corner. And there are deep mystical reasons why it has to be that way. I'm making this up, right? So notice that the ritual and the structure of hierarchy are connected. You follow the ritual if you accept the authority of the person prescribing it. So in a world where it's not top down, ritual might change just for popular reasons. But ritual remains important. And you all know this from a sad thing in life that I dare say we've all been exposed to. What's the right way to get through a funeral? We may have different specific answers, but we each have an answer. Oh, that's not right. Oh, you don't wear that. And so on and so forth. You had the service before Aunt Beatrice could make it from Winnipeg? You mean you waited 3 days before you did a service? You see, you can have different answers, but each one is charged by the force of this is the right order of the world. So ritual will always exist because of that. But how it will change will depend on all sorts of social factors. In some places, it will change quickly and easily, in some places not easily, but it'll always be important to people. That's my prediction. Okay, thank you so much. I've truly, truly appreciated the chance to be with you.
Thank you again for a wonderful presentation, and let's all hope we will see him again in the fall. By all means, speak to the powers that be. If you have enjoyed the lecture series, go and tell Candace, go and tell Isaiah, tell them that we would love to have him back, and I'm reasonably certain it will happen. You all have a great evening.
And if you didn't enjoy the lectures, tell Chaplain Uva what would make you enjoy them.
I thought he was going to say, if you didn't enjoy the lectures, keep it for yourself, but you can come to me. All right. Everybody have a blessed evening. Bye-bye.
This was just a lovely, lovely moment this whole year. I really appreciate that we could do this. Thank you.
Uwe has not learned that we don't use two terms around here, trip and fall.
Okay.
Outstanding.
Thank you, Roger.
I'd like to ask a question, yes or no answer.